Welcome to the Thurman Conversations for August 27th, 2020. Tonight's conversation is between Catlin Keenan, who is one of our very first guests, and Jessica Howard, who works at the ACLU of Colorado, and Catlin will fully introduce Jessica. I'm going to ask everyone to mute themselves and be ready to write any questions that you have in the chat. And I will hand this over to Catlin and Jessica.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to the Thurman Conversations. I'm standing in tonight for Alan, and I'm so pleased to be able to have this conversation with Jessica. So the Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman believed that it was possible to humanize the other, for Black and brown and white people to find each other and be humans together in ways that make us all come alive. My name is Dr. Catlin Keenan. I have dedicated a large portion of my professional life to studying and participating in the dismantling of white supremacy. And so I'm happy to be your guest host tonight. So as Michelle mentioned, as you have questions that occur to you and as the conversation is progressing, feel free to write them in the chat. And then our producer will gather them and share them with us at the end so that we can have an opportunity to engage those questions. This is a chance to ask an expert everything you are wondering about our civil liberties, justice, systemic racism, and the legal system. Today's guest is Jessica Howard. Jessica is the Racial Justice Campaign Coordinator for the ACLU of Colorado. In her role as campaign coordinator, she oversees the development and implementation of public education programs, including Know Your Rights training workshops. In addition to her work at the ACLU, she is a passionate disability rights advocate, having served on the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council, Denver Public Schools Special Education Advisory Council, and Disability Law Colorado's Protection and Advocacy System for Individuals with Mental Illness. And all of those have complicated acronyms. Jessica holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Colorado and a paralegal certificate from the Community College of Aurora. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much for the introduction, both Michelle and Catlin. I'm happy to be here tonight.
Excellent. So let's start, if you wouldn't mind, with the historical context of racial injustice in the United States. Can you give us a brief outline just to get us all on the same page?
Yeah, sure. So, here at the ACLU, we talk a lot about, how we uphold documents like the Declaration of Independence and, the Constitution, and really treat them as like these beacons where we expect that, there will be equal justice for everyone. But of course, we know that the framers left a lot of folks out of that vision. And unfortunately, the problem has always been in our country is like we can't achieve some of these goals because of the entrenched systems in which our country was built on, namely of which racism. So there's this quote from Marsha Chatelain from The Nation. She just put out an article about how racism has impacted housing in America. And she has a quote saying, "The nation's rootedness in slavery and the way white Americans have galvanized the privileges afforded to them are critical to understanding the problem of race in America." And I think that really is a really good way to really encapture it. So, this month, 401 years ago, the first enslaved Africans were brought to the Virginia colony, not as persons, but as property. And unfortunately, they, were treated as such or less than a whole person since then, whether it's being described as 3/5 a person in the Constitution, all the way up to now when you have those who are incarcerated fighting fires in California. And I think what you see is when you have a history where people are treated as property or in some way serves the needs of others and that usefulness, so to speak, is finished, say with the emancipation of those who were enslaved, society tries to figure out what else to do with what they call the undesirables. And so unfortunately it evolves from Black property to Black bodies, but never just humanized as people. So certainly, you know, you could go throughout our history looking not only at enslavement, but other ways in which the country was built on land grabs and genocide with indigenous peoples. But certainly even after slavery and throughout the Reconstruction era, of course, we have, you know, the blowback of that, and that is, you know, racialized fear, Jim Crow laws, going into, you know, lynchings and Klan, you know, the KKK, you know, working throughout the country in terms of ensuring that, you know, the status quo, you know, remains kind of intact. And, you know, I think, you know, for perhaps a lot of folks, you know, here know, like, the Klan didn't just work, you know, in the South. It worked in all parts of our country, even including here in Colorado. The Colorado chapter of the KKK was established in 1915, and you really by the 1920s kind of really infiltrated so many parts of our state government, whether it be members in the legislature, state Supreme Court, Denver District Court, and certainly notable Klans folks that we know of at the time: Denver Mayor Ben Stapleton, the police chief William Candlish, and even the governor Clarence Morley. A little kind of personal story: my great grandparents moved to Colorado from Texas in 1920, and I remember some of the stories that my grandmother would tell us was that when they moved to Colorado, you know, there really was only one neighborhood they could absolutely live in, and that was Five Points. And that it was because the Klan was so prominent during that time, where redlining was such a big issue. And so a lot of folks, you know, they look at Five Points and say, oh, wow, there's all this great rich history, you know, Black culture. Well, that's not by accident. That's because that was really kind of the only place, you know, folks could live during that time. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, we even see today, like, the Klan still has presence, even in Colorado. The Southern Poverty Law Center continues to track them. We do know that there is a little hub even in Grand Junction, in which, you know, some folks work out of. And so, you know, you have that piece, you had genocide and land removals, and you can even look at immigration and the way in which we've treated that, and how our country's long history of xenophobia has found its way into certain policies, whether it be the Chinese Exclusionary Act that was implemented in the 1880s, prohibiting the immigration of Chinese laborers, all the way to the way we saw certain policies even in the Obama and Trump administrations, and how we treat migrant families and keeping children in cages.
Off to a powerful start. So one of the things that your words make me think about is, from privileged perspectives, it's easy to ignore the way that racism has played a role in the very fabric of this country and continues to do so. And so the need for civil rights isn't over. It's not something that, you know, we did a good job, we can check that box. Yeah. So I'm wondering, now this system of injustice has led to this system of racism. We talk about systemic racism in this country that shows up in multiple ways. And I'm wondering if you can speak to, what do you see from your work that you do for the ACLU?
Yeah, so when it comes to racial justice and the issues that we cover in the ACLU, they vary widely. Certainly one of the things that we look at particularly is how racism, systemic racism, works in our public school system. So students of color are too often confined to either racially isolated, underfunded, inferior programs. We can even look where, you know, unfortunately, Black students are suspended and expelled from school 3 times more than white students, and Latinx and Native students aren't far behind on that. And so certainly, like, we know, you know, I think a lot of us kind of know that history of Brown v. Board and, like, keeping schools segregated. And unfortunately, even with the, you know, with that Supreme Court case today. Our schools are very much segregated, and it comes up in various ways. I mean, we can even look at now with the pandemic and remote learning. Why is it that some students have a better way of accessing remote learning than others when like they don't have internet? And a lot of that race and class stratification like intertwines with one another. We see how racial injustice shows up in our housing, particularly when it comes to historical uses of redlining and today's occurrence of gentrification of certain neighborhoods that pushes Black and brown folks out of those what used to be affordable neighborhoods out to some other place. So the relationships that we see between housing, racial inequality, and how that racial wealth gap kind of really shows itself. You know, we look at like the history of Black migration to northern cities in the first half of the 20th century and kind of the development of suburbs after World War II. And when Black population growth, you know, spikes, so does white fear and white flight, and how that ends up playing a role in the way in which homes in neighborhoods and what money kind of goes into some of those things. I don't know if anyone has kind of heard recent in the news how you had this interracial couple putting their house on the market and, you know, getting one appraisal that was $100,000 less than their neighbors. And just from the simple fact of removing, you know, pictures or any inclination of someone of a different race in that home, all of a sudden got them the additional $100,000 on their homes. Like, you can see that. And even nearly a decade after the 2008 financial crisis, there still remains about a 30% gap point between the difference in home ownership between white and Black Americans. And now we look at with the pandemic and a lot of those short-term eviction relief, you know, expiring. You know, if you have a large group of folks who tend to rent versus own, we can see a really damaging, you know, event like coming on the horizon. I think another, of course, place that we, you know, also have seen our work particularly has to do with the healthcare and the impact that COVID has had on particularly vulnerable communities, you know, health disparities that we see experienced by communities of color, particularly Black and Indigenous and Latinx communities, are not, you know, let's make it very clear, are not due to biological difference, because we know that race is a social construct. But instead, sorry, I've been sitting too long, had to turn on the lights. But, you know, instead, you know, these disparities are really proliferated by these external factors that are driven by systemic racism. So Black and brown communities are going to disproportionately experience higher rates of heart disease, asthma, cancer, when there are social decisions as to where, you know, communities of color are permitted or afforded to live, where toxic dumps get cited, whether a neighborhood is deemed worthy enough to obtain a grocery store. Like, all of these have this impact on health disparities, and then add COVID on top of that, you know. And so it wasn't really a matter of if we were going to see more Black and brown people die of COVID. It was just a matter of when and what we were going to do about it. And I think it's important that we hold space, that a lot of that is based in the historical mistreatment of Black and Indigenous peoples in this country. I mean, we could have an entire webinar or, you know, whole libraries could be filled with stories and documentation from experimentation on enslaved women for the advancement of modern gynecology, to withholding known medication to treat syphilis, when these diseases go unchecked. even the forced sterilization of Black women just within the past 40 to 50 years. And then, of course, the main work that we do, particularly at the ACLU when it comes to racial justice, is around our criminal legal system and how it disproportionately targets and incarcerates people of color, as well as criminalize people who are experiencing poverty.
A lot of what you said there really resonates with me as a teacher, teaching in the COVID pandemic and teaching online, and wondering about the students who aren't in my class and why they're not there. And so I think the picture that you paint of this system of injustice is a really powerful one. So with your work with the ACLU, can you speak specifically to how this systemic racism has impacted our legal system and the lives of Black and Brown people?
Yeah, I mean, we can look at, different facets of the criminal legal system. And I think that is really important, for our audience to know that I'm being purposeful about using criminal legal system versus criminal justice system, because when you see these disparities, when you understand how these systems work, it's really hard to say that any justice is being done. It's a system, it's a legal system where people kind of go in. So that's just kind of some intentional language, that I'm using there. And so, we could look at racial profiling. So, for folks, racial profiling really is referring to the discriminatory practice by law enforcement officials and targeting individuals for suspicion of crime based on that individual's race, ethnicity, religion, national origin. So, certainly not only do you have situations in which you have perhaps law enforcement pulling someone over, driving while Black because, they are using these markers to determine, a level of criminality. But on the flip side of that, you have what we call discriminatory omissions on part of law enforcement, really like police turning a blind eye to, crime that is then perpetuated against these very communities that find themselves vulnerable. So certainly you can look back into history in terms of how police may turn a blind eye to release, Black folks who are suspected of crimes to lynch mobs, all the way to, some people suspect, just in the past couple of days, the 17-year-old who is out, as a counter protester and has shot and killed two protesters and is able to walk through the police line and be able to go to bed at night before anyone apprehends them. So those are kind of definitely two things, that we see when it comes to racial profiling. And you can even look at surveillance, throughout our history, surveillance of Black Americans has been widely kind of overlooked or unaddressed throughout our history. Certainly, folks probably have heard of COINTELPRO, in the 1960s, under J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, where they were tracking political activity of, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the Black Power, Black Panther movement. And just for years now, racial justice and civil rights advocates warning, now the use of facial recognition being in the hands of law enforcement targeting Black and Brown communities. It's one of the things that we teach a lot in our Know Your Rights training when it comes to protests, is that the U.S. does have this history of taking some of, whatever's the newest technology and turning it around to use it against folks who don't agree with what, they're doing. And so we always just kind of, tell people to be vigilant about that. Certainly, you can record the police, and police don't have that expectation of privacy, but the people around you may have that expectation of privacy. And so just being mindful that, you do have law enforcement that, are mining social media websites looking for folks, and, can have some really dire, consequences. I think we're kind of seeing, what's happening in Portland as a result of that. People just kind of being picked up from nowhere, wondering how is it that the police are being able to identify them, even to folks who may be undocumented, who are out protesting in fear that, by catching, their face on facial recognition, technology, that might be a way in which officers may then hand them over to ICE or any other immigration enforcement. So that's just kind of like what we see from a wide lens, here in Colorado.
So you said a couple
Sure.
of things that, first of all, I learned something, but I want to circle back on because I think they're really important. And the very last point that you made about being really careful and really mindful about filming during protests and then posting that anywhere, but certainly to social media, I think is a lesson that we all need to really hear. Because sometimes we want to witness and we want to document, but at the same time, we can also be doing damage that we might not be aware of. So I think that that's a really important point. And then you used a couple of great terms that that I wanted to just reiterate. So instead of talking about the criminal justice system, we're talking about the criminal legal system. Is that the term you're using?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's great. I am going to change my language immediately, because I mean, that's such a powerful point. And then the other thing that you said was, and when you were speaking about racial profiling, is you said omissions, like in addition to profiling, did you say criminal omissions? Like that's the turning the blind eye?
Yeah, more of like it's discriminatory omissions. So on one side, you're actively going after folks on the basis of their race, but then when they are victimized, we don't see what is happening. And so like that, it's kind of part of racial profiling, where you have enforcement like very active against these groups, but then also seems to when the time comes when that community might need help and assistance from law enforcement, the speed in which things happen seems to not be up to standard to how quickly they're able to come after these groups.
Sure. No, that's really useful. And it seems like, so people are racially profiled in a variety of ways. And it can impact them in on several different levels. And so obviously you can be profiled as a criminal, but then when you are a victim and you need help, then your victimhood is also overlooked. That's really useful to think about. And so I wanted to move us to get more specific about Colorado. So how do these types of things show up specifically here in our state?
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to, I think, racial profiling, like, for background, like I've been at the ACLU for 8 years, and 6 of those years was as the paralegal here at the affiliate. And a lot of the work, that we were coming across was certain cases where we were seeing how police were using racial profiling to exert excessive force against communities of color. So for example, certainly there are tons of cases I could kind of bring up just within the work that we've done, but perhaps one of the more recent story would be one of a current ACLU case that we are looking at, and that is of Corey Barnes. And so, in this case, 3 Colorado Springs police officers kind of engaged in this racial profiling when they saw Barnes, who is a Black Colorado Springs residents. They detained him without cause. They handcuffed him and searched him illegally. Mr. Barnes did not fit any of the description that the police had gotten from dispatch, other than the fact that he was Black. He didn't have the same clothing. He wasn't even near the same age. And yet, you know, just basically walking while Black was just enough in order to detain him. So the ACLU is suing. We're charging that the police violated his Fourth Amendment rights, which is, you know, forbids that unreasonable detentions and handcuffing and searching. And so, you know, you have that as one of an example. We also know of a story of Rivero Stinnett. He was, you know, this prominent Black Denver artist who was beaten with a studded glove by security guard who were, you know, in contract with RTD while he was waiting for light rail. You know, essentially, you know, the way the story goes is he had headphones on, it's late, he's waiting for light rail. The officers are saying, "What are you doing?" And it's like, "Well, I'm doing what everybody else is doing. I'm waiting for the light rail." And they told him to wait somewhere else. That somewhere else happened to be a secluded area where he was then beaten. He lost use, you know, he suffered permanent brain damage and definitely lost a lot of use of being able to, you know, produce art. And so it just kind of really shows in that sense how racial profiling, it can be emotionally damaging, it can be humiliating for the lives of people who are on the receiving end of that kind of racial profiling. And certainly when we see surveillance in Colorado, our legal director, Mark Silverstein, has had a lot of history of working with the Denver Police Department every time, finding that they're, you know, using some new technology to, you know, mine social media, all the way to holding kind of like dossiers of different, you know, prominent activists in the city, keeping tracks on them. But, you know, some of the things we know that, you know, Denver Police Department has, you know, partnered with Ring, which is Amazon's doorbell company, to surveil, to get access to some of those surveillance videos. And that, you know, there are some other cities that are continuing to also look into that as well. And so we're just kind of always on listening out and on the lookout for some of those things that do happen, because those are some of the things that the ACLU wants to know. We want to know, you know, when you have law enforcement officers using new technology in that way. And so we've definitely seen it in Colorado, but the ACLU has always been willing to either send a very strongly worded letter or file a complaint in order to ensure that people's rights aren't violated in that way.
That's powerful stuff. The story of the Denver artist is so poignant because he lost his ability to do art. Like that story just breaks my heart. I mean, it all breaks my heart, but God, something about, maybe as a creative person myself, I'm like, oh my God, I can't, it brings tears to my eyes. So policing, of course, has been in the news here in Colorado, not just in the stories that you mentioned, but in a lot of other activities as well, both in Aurora, but also in other cities, of course. And so we're hearing a lot about the defund the police, PIC abolition, the criminal, we're not calling it criminal justice anymore, but reform. And so what is that conversation about?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, certainly, you know, here's the thing, you know, when it comes to what we're hearing in the news and what we're seeing on social media, like, I think for like a lot of folks, it's probably like really shocking, you know, how can this be happening? You know, here's the thing, you know, Black communities have been talking about this for decades, for centuries really. It's just now that we have technology shining a light on it. I wish, you know, folks kind of just believed us when we said it, that, you know, we have, you know, these video footages to kind of really show, you know, the world, like, no, this is what is really happening. And so, yeah, it has been in the news quite a bit. And I think every time it does come into the news, the question is like, okay, well, what can we do better? What can we do to like reform it, a bit more? But there's some folks who have been working on this topic for decades. And so for folks, PIC abolition, PIC refers to the prison industrial complex. And so, I'll talk a little bit about like, part of the same coin isn't just policing, but it's also what we do with our prisons as well. And so, I think that, again, in the age of technology, folks who may not have had a pulse on what is happening in the Black and Brown communities are beginning to see what is happening. But I think first, just it's a big issue. And so I'll try to, give, as much of a 30,000 foot level as I can. But I think it's really important that when we are talking about policing, we understand that there is a difference between what we say in terms of police and policing. And we really need to distinguish between what that narrow set of functions are that are performed by police or law enforcement, and then the more broader process of like policing and how we like regulate folks' lives. So police are going to be those state actors who, enforce the law. Policing are really those actions to patrol neighborhoods and communities in ways, that kind of keep the status quo, and particularly in Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. But what's really important to understand about policing is that it's not just police and law enforcement officers who can do policing. Other state actors can do policing as well. It's why we see school to prison pipeline in the education system, because we are using education to police these communities. We can use also social workers to police folks who are turning to services. And so really just kind of looking at, is this the way in which we think we are able to stave off crime? Do we think that, it leads to, a better life for everyone? A lot of people would say no, like it doesn't. I mean, when we talk about policing, I think, again, for that historical context, we can trace modern day policing back to essentially the protection of property. Whether it's in the form of slave patrols in the South or reining in labor unions and immigrants in the North. At the end of the day, what we talk about is, if you understand the role of policing in our society, then you can kind of, begin to have a conversation as to, is the system actually really broken? Or is it working the way in which it was designed to do? And so I think the big takeaway from this is that, there's been activism around the issue of policing for decades. I think it's really important for people who are listening just to educate themselves about the real historical context of policing, what the institution is designed to protect and whom. And we have to look beyond just a reform here or reform there, because I think we can see even after the killings of Eric Gardner, Michael Brown, Elijah McClain, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the list goes on, and now Jacob Blake, something isn't working with the reforms. And we have to ask ourselves, what do we really value in this country? Because if we value people and all people like we claim to do, then why are these extrajudicial murders by state actors still happening? And so hopefully that, it's just a conversation that is just now kind of gaining mainstream, but it's definitely been a conversation that folks have been having for a while. But, of course, again, as I was mentioning, if we are to talk about policing, we also have to talk about prisons and therefore kind of mass incarceration, because they are two sides of the same coin in the way it helps exacerbate some of that racial justice. And so, when slavery ended, white Southerners were kind of presented with this dilemma, without the labor of enslaved people, their economy collapses, and so what do they do to maintain that, white hierarchy and social control? And so certainly you have the Reconstruction era where, Black men were, beginning to kind of get the enfranchisement to vote. You're getting, representatives in Congress, and then the blowback with, therefore white panic, outrage, KKK, we know this, kind of song and dance. But on the same side of it, you have these southern states creating and enforcing laws around mischief and vagrancy. And these laws are really just strictly used to enforce against Black citizens. And it also resulted in many prisoners also obtaining court fees and debts, not very different than what we see today. And so there was an enormous market for convict leasing during that time, where prisoners were contracted out to laborers at the highest bidder. We see that today when we're looking at, prisoners who have to go fight fires in California. We're like, oh yeah, those are fires. Those are incarcerated folks who are having to do that. And so now it goes from people who were enslaved becoming, who were property of, private citizens to now property of the state. And so, we see that, and we see kind of that uptick of it. We see then how the war of drugs, like, really helped to kind of just blow this, out. And, the kind of the mandatory minimums that kind of came out of that, particularly for drug convictions, and how some, certain drugs, get more of a severe punishment for others. And it doesn't then become very difficult to see, even though you have crack cocaine and powder cocaine, one, gets you, some probation and maybe a couple of months in jail, and some can get you years and decades. And so over the past 5 decades, the U.S. has seen the increase in the reliance of the criminal legal system as a way to respond to drug addiction, mental health issues, and economic issues kind of related to poverty. In Colorado, the biggest drive of that mass incarceration is the overpopulation of our facilities. We can see just in 2014, I believe, Colorado had the 9th highest incarceration rate for Black folks and the 4th highest incarceration rate for Latinx people in the country. And so even though, the Black citizens in Colorado only made up 4% of Colorado's population in 2017, they were making up 18% of the Colorado prison population. And so, here at the ACLU, decarceration is a big part of, the work that we do, because it's costly. It's not, reforming people the way that we say that it is. And now that we're seeing the spread of COVID in our prisons, and the call for it becomes even that much greater. And we see how structural racism is even playing out in that. People are held in cages, whether it be, again, for nonviolent crimes or drug offenses, or because they are too poor to afford the bail money they need for their release. So, certainly, we've been kind of uplifting kind of some stories that we're seeing, because of the spread of COVID, and really, asking, why are folks who are older, who are medically vulnerable, folks who do not pose that kind of safety risk, still staying in prison? Because, regardless of how you believe in terms of, whether people have done their crime or not, no one deserves to die of COVID, even those folks who are incarcerated.
There's a lot of powerful stuff in your words, and I so personally, I'm interested in advocate for the abolishment of the death penalty, which Colorado just became an anti-death penalty state. But the 3 men on death row are all Black.
Yes, they're all Black. They all went to the same high school. They
Yeah.
all, were sentenced in the 18th Judicial District. And, I think about this all the time. I live in Denver, but I don't live that far from the Aurora, line.
Yep.
I mean, you're talking about a 2-mile difference in terms of like my chances or my son's chances or my partner's chances of
being in that district.
It being in that district and perhaps getting a different outcome.
Right.
Because of it.
So, Jessica, let's talk about solutions for a little while. So what solutions can we, your audience, work on with you, and like, what can we do right now?
Well, we have quite a few of them for sure, particularly as we are, coming into the elections, the season. So, definitely one of the things we talk about when we are talking about the criminal legal system is the need for prosecutorial reform and asking people to pay attention to their district attorney races. We have reports that even though most district attorneys are elected officials, about 70% of these district attorneys run unopposed during re-election. We want folks to understand that these attorneys really have an enormous power in our system. Historically, DAs have wielded their power to pack our jails and prisons, interrupt the lives of not only the defendants, but their families, and kind of really deepen some of those racial disparities that we do see. They have they have power to charge folks, determine bail, influence sentencing decisions, but they also have the power to champion real change. And, certainly some of the polling that we've seen across the country is that regardless of what aisle you kind of land on, people agree that change is definitely needed. The only way we can do that is really to hold them accountable and tell them we are watching. Another thing is, as you're beginning to hear about PIC abolition and policing, support those grassroots movements that are calling for the reinvestment of services and not the over-policing of communities. Because I think at the end of the day, that really is the takeaway message when we are hearing a lot of these words around abolition and policing, is that we want the services to go into the community, not to over police. How do we reinvest our taxpayer dollars into the things that we are really actually calling for, and really, giving it to the community to be able to figure out what they believe those, solutions are to some of those issues. But I say grassroots organizations for sure, because, at the ACLU, we do a lot of work around this, but we are a really big organization. Like, this has really been a conversation of people who have been really close to the community. And so we definitely encourage that. And also, I'd probably say last but not least is that, we are continuing to work to decarcerate our jails and our prisons. Today just happens to be our day of action around this particular issue. I don't know, how many folks, in the audience were able to tune into the ACLU's panel last night that we had, where we had a panel of family members talk about the impact of having a loved one in our jails and prisons. And now with COVID, how urgent that need is in order to get folks who are medically vulnerable out on some kind of compassionate release. So, yeah, in terms of what you can do about it, again, the ACLU, we're working with about 50 other nonprofits to do this day of action. What we're asking you to do is our action is directed to Governor Polis. We are asking folks to either call, email, if you're really good at social media, to really urge him to safely release our elderly and our at-risk people who are in the population. So yeah, you can still do it even tonight. I would say if you are really good about calling, I will give you his phone number right now. So to call his front desk, you can call 303-866-2471. Again, the number is 303-866-2471. And, you can you can leave a message. You can say, hi, my name is Jessica. I live in Denver. As a Coloradoan and a constituent, I'm concerned, that hundreds of medically vulnerable and elderly people continue to be incarcerated in Colorado in these unsafe prisons. We're calling, the governor, we're calling him to exercise his clemency and commutation powers to save lives, because it's not just about the lives that are behind bars. We know that there are people who go in and out of prisons, particularly our correction officers who go into prisons, and whatever they're bringing in from community, from their family, they bring it in to prisons. But see, prisons aren't medical wards, and so they don't have the capacity to be able, if there's an outbreak, to do anything about it. And so it really puts these prisoners in a really unsafe situation. Again, we talk about redemption is possible, and compassion is possible. And so that is definitely, that's one thing you can do before you go to bed. Give them a call. Again, you can either also email him if you prefer to write. His email is governorpolis@state.co.us. Again, it's governorpolis@state.co.us. But yeah, it truly is just letting him know that we are going to hold him accountable in order to protect the lives of our neighbors and our family.
Yeah, great immediate action step that we can all take. So I'm looking at the questions who are coming in, and it looks like at least one of them we've actually already answered, about sort of changing systemic racism. And really the message here is, first of all, to vote, but second of all, to really pay attention to your local elections, and specifically the lawyers and judges in our local systems, many of whom you said 70%, I believe you said, run unopposed, which,
yes,
first of all,
the district attorneys across the state, we consider to be the prosecutors that really have a hand in terms of how people move throughout the legal system. Yes, 70%, about 70% of those district attorneys run unopposed.
All right, so I'm going to get a law degree and run for public office.
There you go. There you
go. Okay, so here's a question that I don't know the answer to. Maybe you do. The question is it still true that schools are funded by property taxes, and that because Black-owned properties are lower value, that contributes to underfunded schools for children of color?
So in Colorado, definitely we have kind of local rule. And so definitely each district gets to determine how they run their schools, how they are funded, things like that. So I don't know if it would be safe to say that is the base standard, but we do know that there are some school districts that do rely upon property taxes in order to do that. And so, yeah, certainly one of the big things that have been discussed is if you have a neighborhood whose homes are valued less, then the property taxes may not fully support all of that. But again, it really kind of depends on each district. You may have districts who have homes that are worth a lot, but they may not necessarily get all of their money from those property taxes, and instead may have like families who, you know, can afford to just write a check. So I really say it really depends on districts and how they use that money. But in the state of Colorado, yeah, there is portions of that funding does come from property taxes. So
Okay. So the other thing that people can do is they can educate themselves about how their local district is funded, see if there's anything locally that they can do. So the next question is super interesting to me. So what, or does the ACLU have any specific suggestions about if we see police brutality happening as bystanders? Are there specific actions we should or should not take? Does the ACLU offer some guidance there?
we absolutely do. It's definitely one of the Know Your Rights trainings that I put on quite a bit when it comes to police encounters. And so certainly the big takeaway is to be a good witness, you know, for certain. But of course, one of the things that I always say is that, you know, it shouldn't be the citizen's job to de-escalate these situations. It really should be on police. And yet we still see issues where police come in at a 10 and it's up to us to kind of de-escalate in order to keep ourselves safe. And so definitely if you are a bystander and you are seeing a situation where, you know, there's a police interaction, know that you do have the right to record the police. As long as you're not obstructing like what they are doing in that moment, you can use your phone. We do have a mobile justice app where if you were to download it, basically you could start a recording on your phone by video. And when that recording stops, whether it's because you turned your phone off or, you know, it gets broken, then the recording stops and it gets sent to the ACLU. So yes, know that you do have the right to record police. Police do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy in public. So if you do find yourself in that situation, you are recording, and police come to you and say, oh, you can't record, you can calmly let them know you do have the right to record. But it really is use your discretion. If you think that it's going to be a situation where your body is like in jeopardy, then you have to kind of weigh, you know, like how much of that is worth. But certainly the other thing that I would say though is you may want to record, but if say that person you're recording is saying, please don't record this because, you know, people record, they post to social media, person has no clue, then I would also say to respect that request as well. I usually say what's really important, you can do the video recording, but even if it is a voice recording afterwards, record descriptions, which police department is the one involved, you know, did you see a badge number? What, you know, what cross streets were you on? What kind of day, you know, time of day it was? Because sometimes, you know, but by the time things have ended, you know, you can't remember much, but, you know, those are kind of some of those little things, you know, you can do. And then, you know, if it gets to a situation where that person's able to walk away from that encounter safely, then to give them that information. So then that way, if they do believe that their rights were violated in that moment, they can take that information to file an internal affairs complaint, because a lot of the online complaint forms ask for that very information.
Great. Those are some great, really practical tips. And I think that Michelle dropped the information about the app in the chat, which is great. And so we are approaching the hour here. And so Jessica, I just want to thank you so much for having this conversation with us this evening. And thank you for being a part of the Thurman Conversations, all of us. And just a reminder that this conversation series is sponsored by the Race Task Force of the Episcopal Church in Colorado and St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Lakewood. And so please come back every couple of weeks. There's going to be more speakers and more events. And so the next speaker isn't quite lined up yet, but then on September 24th, there's going to be another Modus Theater collaboration called Women of Resolution. And so definitely take a look for that. And so Jessica, I want to give you the last word. If you want to tell us where to find you, where to find the ACLU, take it away.
Yes, so definitely you can find us on our website at aclu-co.org. If you use social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Facebook is a really great way to find out for any events that we're doing. So even though we're not doing in-person events, we're doing quite a few virtual events, which we call Advocacy from Home. And so we'll cover a variety of topics. Certainly we covered a lot during COVID when it came to racial disparities, how, immigrants may be impacted, but now we're kind of going into our election seasons for sure. We're hoping to put on an educational webinar series about policing, about defunding, and what folks can perhaps do as it relates to advocating in local politics, like their city council meetings. And so definitely we're working to put on that kind of content, as well as we will be offering next month probably a couple of DA 101 webinars as well. People want to know a little bit more about what a DA is, how they work, why it's important. Certainly we continue to talk about decarceration and quite a few other things. So definitely those places are a really great place to get information. And if anyone wants to contact me, I can definitely give you my email. My email is jhoward, HOWARD, at aclu-co.org.
Got it. Thank you so much, Jessica. It's been
Yes, thank you.
And thank you everyone for participating. Have a good night.